By the time the first pale mist had lifted from the churchyard and the roofs of St Mary Mead had begun to shine faintly under the morning sun, everyone in the village already knew that Captain Edward Ainsworth was coming back. It was Mrs. Bantry who had first mentioned it at the Vicarage Garden Committee, while adjusting the brim of her hat and pretending, not very successfully, that the news had not interested her more than the question of winter pansies. Captain Ainsworth, she said, had written to Colonel Bantry from abroad, announcing that he intended to spend a quiet fortnight in the village before going on to London. And since he had once been almost family to the people of St Mary Mead, there could be no question of his staying at the inn when Gossington Hall had more rooms than anyone could reasonably use. There had been a little silence after that, the sort of silence which descends when a familiar name returns after a long absence, carrying with it memories that belong to several people at once. Captain Ainsworth had left St Mary Mead 12 years earlier, not under any disgrace, nor after any quarrel that could be clearly remembered, but with the faint shadow that always follows a departure which happens just after an engagement is broken. At the time, everyone had known, or believed they knew, that he had been quietly attached to Miss Clara West, the rector's niece, who had spent 2 summers in the village and had been admired for her calm manners, her pale blue dresses, and the composed way she listened when others spoke. Clara had not married him, however, and Edward had gone away soon after, first to Egypt, then to India, then to places that sounded very hot and very far away when repeated over tea. In the years that followed, he had become a figure safely fixed in the past, which meant that people could speak of him kindly without the inconvenience of having him present. Miss Marple, sitting near the window with her knitting folded neatly in her lap, had said very little when the matter was discussed, though she had asked whether Captain Ainsworth still took milk in his tea. It was an odd question, or at least it seemed so to Miss Hartnell, who preferred conversation to move in more substantial directions. But Mrs. Bantry had answered that she had no idea, and Miss Marple had smiled as though this were perfectly satisfactory. The train from London arrived at Much Benham Station at 4:03, and Colonel Bantry's motor car returned to St Mary Mead shortly before 5. Several curtains moved at that hour, though not all of them admitted afterward to having done so. Captain Ainsworth sat beside the Colonel, wearing a dark coat, a soft felt hat, and the weary expression of a man who had seen too much of the world to be surprised by a village lane. He was thinner than people remembered, and rather greyer at the temples, but not in a way that diminished him. If anything, the years had sharpened his appearance, giving his face a distinction it had perhaps not possessed in youth. He greeted Mrs. Bantry on the steps of Gossington Hall with warmth, though he did not kiss her hand as he once might have done. And when he entered the drawing-room, he looked around with a long, quiet smile. "Nothing changes here," he said. It was a natural remark, and one that people who return after many years often make, but Mrs. Bantry, who was pleased by it, repeated it later to several people. "Nothing changes here. It sound affectionate in St Mary Mead." Affection was always welcomed when it came from someone who had been away long enough to compare the village with less civilized parts of the world. That evening there was a small dinner at Gossington Hall. Not a formal party, but one of those gatherings that become formal because everyone understands that they are being observed by everyone else. The vicar and Griselda came along with Miss Marple, Dr. Haydock, Mrs. Price Ridley, and Mr. Raymond West, who happened to be staying with his aunt and had already formed several opinions about the dramatic possibilities of a man returning to the scene of an old disappointment. Captain Ainsworth behaved beautifully. That was the general verdict. He remembered names, asked after relatives, admired the garden, laughed at Colonel Bantry's stories, and spoke with just enough reserve about foreign places to suggest experience without boasting of it. if he seemed changed, it was only in the way people expected a man to change after 12 years of heat, travel, illness, and perhaps loneliness. Only once did the conversation falter noticeably. It happened when Griselda mentioned Clara West, quite innocently, saying that she had received a Christmas card from her the previous year and believed she was now living near Bath with an elderly aunt. Captain Ainsworth looked up from his glass, and for the briefest moment his face became entirely still. Then he smiled. Clara always preferred quiet places, he said. There was nothing wrong with the words, nor with the tone, which was gentle and almost amused. But Miss Marple, who had been counting stitches, did not count the next one. She looked at his hands instead. They were steady, well kept, and browned by the sun, yet when he replaced his glass on the table, his fingers touched the stem twice. As though confirming it was there, Dr. Haydock began speaking about rheumatism in damp climates, and the moment passed. After dinner, in the drawing-room, Captain Ainsworth moved among the guests with practised ease, but his attention returned more than once to the small rosewood writing desk near the window. It was not a valuable piece, and Mrs. Bantry, noticing his glance, laughed and said it had been in that corner forever, though she personally thought it awkward and much too low for anyone over 12. Captain Ainsworth said he remembered it. My mother used to write letters at a desk very like that, he added. Again, there was nothing strange in the remark, unless one happened to remember, as Miss Marple did, that Mrs. Ainsworth had never lived in St Mary Mead, and that Edward, during the years he had visited the Bantrys as a young man, had once declared the desk a ridiculous contraption suitable only for unpaid bills and uncomfortable secrets. But memories alter with time, and it is never wise to accuse them too quickly. The next morning, Captain Ainsworth walked through the village. He stopped at the post office, spoke to Mrs. Pollitt outside the Blue Boar, and stood for several minutes by the church gate, looking toward the rectory garden, where Clara West had once cut roses for the altar. Several people saw him there and thought it touching. Miss Hartnell, who saw him from across the road, later said he looked like a man praying, though Miss Hartnell often improved observations after making them. Miss Marple saw him too, from her front garden, where she was cutting faded chrysanthemums. She did not call out at once. Instead, she watched him turn from the churchyard path and look toward the vicarage windows, and she noticed that his expression did not soften at the sight, as one might expect from a man remembering old happiness or old pain. It was attentive rather than sentimental, measuring rather than longing. When he finally saw her, he came over at once and removed his hat. Miss Marple, he said with real pleasure, or something very close to it. You have not changed at all. That is what people are kind enough to say, Miss Marple replied. Though mirrors are less charitable, he laughed, and the laugh was pleasant. But Miss Marple noticed that he had not used her Christian name. In former days he had never called her Jane, of course, because young men did not address elderly ladies so freely. But he had once had a teasing habit of calling her our village oracle, a phrase that had embarrassed her and amused everyone else. It did not matter that he had not repeated it. One could hardly expect a man to remember every foolish thing said in youth. Still, Miss Marple had always found that people forget events more easily than habits. They spoke of ordinary matters, the village, the weather, Colonel Bantry's health, and how much the lanes had narrowed now that motor cars used them more frequently. Captain Ainsworth said all the proper things, and yet there was a curious absence in the conversation, not of memory, but of attachment. He remembered enough facts to satisfy anyone listening, but he did not seem to remember the feeling of them. As he walked away, Miss Marple remained by the gate with the chrysanthemums in her basket, and her face took on that mild, troubled expression which had so often preceded revelations that others later described as astonishing. At luncheon, Mrs. Bantry announced that Captain Ainsworth had accepted invitations all over the village, and that it was wonderful to see how fond people still were of him. Colonel Bantry said the fellow was quieter than he used to be, but sound, absolutely sound, and Dr. Haydock, who had dropped in before surgery, remarked that men who had spent years abroad often came back with a different manner, especially if they had been ill. Miss Marple agreed that illness could change a person very much. Then she added, in the same gentle voice, that it was curious how some things did not change at all. No one asked what she meant, partly because Mrs. Bantry was ringing for coffee, and partly because remarks made by Miss Marple often seemed harmless until much later, when one wished rather desperately that one had listened more carefully. The first real uneasiness did not come from anything Captain Ainsworth did wrong, because he did very little wrong, and that in a village like St Mary Mead was almost more noticeable than a mistake. He accepted invitations with gratitude, listened when elderly ladies spoke, praised Mrs. Price Ridley's seed cake without overdoing the compliment, and remembered that the vicar disliked being interrupted when speaking about parish repairs. He walked the lanes at the correct leisurely pace, admired the cottages that expected admiration, and paused at the familiar corners with the expression of a man revisiting places that had shaped him. Yet the village, which forgave many sins and invented several others, had a precise instinct for small falseness, and within 2 days people had begun saying that dear Edward was altered. Mrs. Bantry, who felt responsible for him as her guest, defended the change with generous firmness. 12 years abroad would alter anyone, she said, especially a man who had lived through fevers, difficult climates, and lonely stations where letters arrived late and people disappeared without warning. Colonel Bantry agreed, though he admitted, privately and only once, that Ainsworth no longer laughed before the end of a joke, which had once been one of his most irritating and charming habits. The remark might have vanished had Miss Marple not been present when he said it. She was arranging flowers in the morning room, placing white chrysanthemums in a blue vase, and she looked up only briefly, as if the observation had floated past her rather than settled somewhere important. At tea that afternoon, Captain Ainsworth visited the vicarage, where Griselda had invited a small group under the excuse of using up a sponge cake that had not risen properly. Miss Hartnell came, of course, because she always discovered charitable reasons for attending other people's teas, and Mr. Raymond West sat near the window, watching the scene with the faintly amused air of a man who believed village life existed to provide material for cleverer minds. Captain Ainsworth was at ease, but not relaxed. There is a difference, though it is one people often miss. Ease can be learned, polished, carried from drawing room to drawing room, like a walking stick. Relaxation belongs to familiarity, and familiarity shows itself in careless gestures, in the way a person reaches for the sugar without looking, or avoids a chair because it has always creaked, or smiles at a private association before anyone else has spoken. Captain Ainsworth did none of those things. When Griselda offered him tea, he hesitated before saying, "No milk, thank you." Miss Hartnell, who had known him before he left, blinked. "Really? I thought you always took milk, Captain Ainsworth." He smiled at her with perfect courtesy. Did I? Perhaps I did. One changes habits without noticing. It was a reasonable answer, and perhaps for that reason everyone accepted it too quickly. People are often relieved when an explanation arrives ready-made, because it saves them the discomfort of forming a question of their own. Miss Marple, seated near the hearth with her knitting, said nothing. The conversation moved to Clara West. As conversations in St Mary Mead tended to move toward the one subject everyone pretended not to be seeking, Griselda mentioned that Clara had become involved in some charitable work near Bath, and Miss Hartnell added that she had always thought Clara a little too reserved, though of course reserve could be very admirable in moderation. Captain Ainsworth stirred his tea. "Yes," he said. She had a quiet strength. It was a fine phrase, and it suited Clara. But Mr. Raymond West noticed that his aunt had lowered her eyes to her knitting with an expression he knew very well. It was the expression she wore when somebody had said something both correct and incomplete. A little later, Miss Marple asked whether he had seen the old summer-house since his return. Captain Ainsworth looked toward her. "The summer-house?" "In the rectory garden," she said mildly. "You used to shelter there when it rained, if I remember rightly." There was a pause. Not long enough to be called hesitation by anyone who did not already expect one. "Ah, yes," he said, smiling. "Of course." "The summer-house." Miss Hartnell laughed with the happy authority of someone able to supply other people's memories. "That was where you and Clara were caught in that dreadful storm, was it not? Poor Clara came in with her hem soaked through, and you looked as though you had enjoyed every minute." Captain Ainsworth smiled again, but this time it did not reach his eyes. "I had forgotten that," he said. No one blamed him. It was only a small village incident, 12 years old, and the world had provided him with larger storms since then. Still, there are things a man forgets because they were unimportant. And there are things he forgets because they were never his to remember in the first place. The difficulty lies in telling one kind from the other before harm is done. That evening, the first letter arrived. It was not dramatic. There was no threatening hand, no torn envelope, no scent of foreign danger. It came by the ordinary post addressed to Captain Edward Ainsworth at Gossington Hall, and it was placed on the silver tray with Colonel Bantry's agricultural circulars and Mrs. Bantry's invitation to a lecture on church. Embroidery. Mrs. Bantry noticed only that Captain Ainsworth took it quickly. He glanced at the handwriting, and for 1 second all the agreeable life went out of his face. Then he folded the envelope into his pocket without opening it and asked whether the colonel still kept the old setter's collar in the gun-room. It was a clever question, because Colonel Bantry immediately began a long story about dogs, loyalty, and the regrettable decline of proper breeding standards. And Mrs. Bantry, who had intended to ask about the letter, forgot to do so. But Miss Marple, who had come to dinner again at Mrs. Bantry's insistence, did not forget. She had seen the handwriting too, not clearly, but clearly enough to notice the slant of it. And although she could not have sworn to whom it belonged, she knew that Captain Ainsworth had recognized it before he read a single word. Later, after the ladies had gone upstairs, Mrs. Bantry found him alone in the passage outside the morning-room. He was standing by the little rosewood desk, the same desk he had claimed to remember from his mother's house, and he had one hand resting on the locked drawer. "Looking for paper?" she asked. He turned at once, and his answer came smoothly. "I thought I might write a note before bed. But I see I have forgotten my fountain pen. There are pens in the drawer, I think," Mrs. Bantry said, moving toward it. No, he said, a little too quickly, then softened the interruption with a laugh. "Do not trouble yourself. It can wait." There was no reason for Mrs. Bantry to think anything of it, except that people only say something can wait when it cannot. The next morning, the village learned that Captain Ainsworth had gone out early, before breakfast, and had walked toward the rectory garden. That, too, was easily explained. Old memories, everyone said. A man returned to the place where youth had left one of its bruises. Miss Marple heard this from her maid, who had heard it from the baker's boy, who had seen the captain coming back by the lane behind the church with mud on his shoes and a folded paper crushed tightly in his hand. At 11 o'clock, Miss Marple took her basket and went to call on Griselda. She did not ask at once about Captain Ainsworth. She admired the fire, praised the marmalade, and inquired after the vicar's cold. Only when Griselda mentioned, with some amusement, that the captain had asked whether the old summer-house was still standing, did Miss Marple look up. "And is it?" she asked. "No," Griselda said. "It was taken down years ago, before we came. There is only a patch of nettles now." Miss Marple nodded gently. "How very interesting," she said. It was not interesting in the way Griselda understood the word. There was no scandal in a demolished summer-house, no crime in a forgotten path, and no visible danger in a man who remembered some things too well and others not well enough. But the truth, when it is present from the beginning, rarely announces itself with force. More often, it sits among ordinary details, waiting for someone to notice that a returned friend may bring back the right face, the right name, and the right sorrow, while leaving behind the one thing no imposture can easily burrow, the private shape of memory. If you enjoy mysteries where the answer is not hidden from you, but quietly placed in plain sight, subscribing to the channel helps keep these slow, careful stories coming, with clues that matter, characters who reveal themselves through behavior, and endings that feel earned because the truth was always there. By the third day of Captain Ainsworth's stay, St Mary Mead had reached the delicate stage in village suspicion when everyone sensed that something was wrong and no one wished to be the first to say what it might be. There had been no quarrel, no theft, no drunken scene, no unexplained cry in the night. The captain continued to behave impeccably. He attended morning service, complimented the choir despite its uneven attack on the final hymn, sent flowers to Mrs. Price Ridley after hearing she had a headache, and offered to judge the produce table at the parish harvest luncheon. That last kindness would have secured affection in almost any English village. The luncheon itself was held in the assembly room beside the parish hall, a cheerful place with polished wooden floors, high windows, and a smell that permanently combined beeswax, tea, and old committee decisions. Long tables were laid with pies, cold meats, trifles, jars of pickled onions, and cakes whose decorations suggested more enthusiasm than balance. The villagers arrived in their best practical clothes, ready to eat generously while criticizing portions elsewhere. Captain Ainsworth entered with Colonel Bantry and was immediately surrounded. He managed the occasion admirably. He praised the marrows, laughed at the vicar's remarks about surplus cabbage, and showed the proper admiration for Mrs. Pollitt's plum tart. If he seemed tired now and then, it was attributed to travel. If he watched people too carefully, it was attributed to loneliness. Villagers are merciful when they wish to be. Miss Marple sat near the end of the second table, where she could observe without appearing to do so. "Remarkable fellow," said Dr. Haydock quietly, glancing toward Captain Ainsworth. "Carried himself well after years abroad, nerves perhaps a little overstrained." "Yes," said Miss Marple. Though nerves often attach themselves to the wrong cause, the doctor looked at her with interest. But she had already turned to smile at Mrs. Bantry. The disturbance, when it came, was small enough at first to be mistaken for clumsiness. A tray of glasses slipped in the hands of young Elsie Martin, who helped at parish events and was admired chiefly because she was efficient enough to alarm older women. 2 glasses broke. Several people exclaimed. Captain Ainsworth turned sharply at the sound. That in itself meant nothing. But instead of laughing, or stepping aside, or helping the girl as most men would, he moved instinctively toward the side door near the kitchen passage and stopped only when he realized that everyone was looking elsewhere. Then he recovered himself at once. "Poor child," he said warmly. "Are you cut?" Elsie, who was not cut and never liked being called poor child, said no. The matter might have ended there, had Miss Hartnell not remarked loudly that Edward had always hated broken glass. She said that as a boy he could not bear the sound of it, and once ran half the length of the cricket field when a lemonade bottle shattered near the pavilion. People laughed. Captain Ainsworth laughed too. "Did I?" he said. "You did indeed," cried Miss Hartnell. "You turned white as linen. How humiliating," he said pleasantly. Again, the answer was excellent. Too excellent, perhaps. Men embarrassed by childhood memories usually deny them, argue details, or blame cousins. They do not accept them gracefully unless they have no memory of them at all. After luncheon, prizes were distributed for jams, dahlias, onions, and a knitted tea cosy of alarming ambition. Captain Ainsworth presented ribbons with charm and said kind things to the unsuccessful. During this, Miss Marple noticed something else. Whenever anyone approached him unexpectedly from behind, he stiffened before turning. Not dramatically. Only a tightening at the shoulders, a brief readiness, gone in an instant. A man may acquire such habits abroad, of course. Yet habits gained under danger do not usually vanish during cake judging and reappear at footsteps. Later, in the garden behind the hall, where coffee was served beneath striped awnings, Mr. Raymond West found material too tempting to resist. "There is a novel in this," he murmured to Miss Marple. "Returned colonial gentleman, old love affair. Secret anxiety. Perhaps blackmail, my dear Raymond," said Miss Marple. "Real blackmailers are rarely as decorative as fiction prefers, but you see it too. I see many things," said Miss Marple. "Understanding them is another matter." He followed her gaze. Captain Ainsworth stood with Mrs. Bantry and Mrs. Price Ridley near the hydrangeas. Across the lawn, by the gate, a woman had just entered the grounds, a tall figure in travelling clothes, carrying a small valise and asking someone for directions. She was not young, though still handsome in the firm-featured way of women who have learned to depend on themselves. There was dust on her hem and determination in her stride. When Captain Ainsworth saw her, the cup in his hand tilted slightly. Coffee spilled onto the grass. Mrs. Bantry exclaimed. Mrs. Price Ridley fussed for a napkin. The woman at the gate stopped, seeing him. For a second neither moved. Then Captain Ainsworth set down the cup and walked toward her with measured calm. "Mrs. Latham," he said, so he knew her. The woman gave him a look impossible to mistake. It was not surprise. It was recognition sharpened by anger long carried. "Captain," she said. "No more than that." They spoke aside near the yew hedge, too low for words to travel, but expressions often travel farther than sound. She spoke rapidly. He answered once, briefly. She took something from her bag, papers perhaps, folded and tied with string. He did not touch them. At last she said something that made him glance involuntarily toward the others, toward the villagers, toward the audience. Then he seemed to remember himself and smiled, as though discussing train delays. She turned and left through the gate without taking coffee. Naturally, the entire village wished to know who she was. Captain Ainsworth provided the explanation before anyone could ask twice. "A widow I knew in Bombay," he said lightly. "Her husband served in administration. A difficult woman, I fear. And perpetually in financial trouble. There are explanations that settle a room, and explanations that merely cover it like a cloth under which movement continues. This was the second kind. Mrs. Bantry accepted it because she wanted to. Colonel Bantry dismissed the woman as a nuisance. Miss Hartnell repeated the phrase difficult woman 3 times before tea. Miss Marple said nothing until she was walking home with Dr. Haydock. "Well," said the doctor. She did not look like a woman asking for money. "No?" "No," said Miss Marple. She looked like a woman asking for acknowledgement. That evening, another curious matter occurred. The captain asked whether any telegrams had come. Mrs. Bantry said none. He seemed relieved, though letters apparently troubled him and telegrams reassured him, which was an arrangement opposite to that of most sensible people. After dinner he excused himself early, saying he had correspondence to manage. Colonel Bantry offered the library. Captain Ainsworth declined and instead requested the little morning room with the rosewood desk. Mrs. Bantry, remembering nothing more than that men liked privacy when writing dull letters, agreed à tea once. Near midnight, when the household was quiet, a faint sound came from below. Not loud enough to wake sleepers, but enough to reach the ears of those who were not sleeping. Miss Marple, who was staying the night because of rain and Colonel Bantry's insistence, opened her door and listened. A drawer being shut, then footsteps, then silence. The next morning, the drawer of the rosewood desk was found unlocked for the first time in years, though nothing inside seemed missing except a packet of old household stationery and a photograph whose absence no one noticed yet. But Miss Marple noticed the empty rectangular space in the dust. And she noticed something else besides. Captain Ainsworth, at breakfast, had begun buttering toast with his left hand. By the 4th morning, St Mary Mead had become divided into 2 camps, though neither side would have admitted the division plainly. There were those who believed Captain Ainsworth was troubled by some private matter from abroad and ought to be left in peace, and those who believed he was hiding something far nearer home and therefore ought to be watched discreetly by everyone. Since the second group included most of the village, the practical result was the same. Mrs. Bantry remained loyal, though increasingly flurried. She said several times that Edward was overwrought, and each time she said it with greater emphasis, as people do when trying to persuade themselves through others. Colonel Bantry declared that no decent man should be stared at over breakfast merely because he preferred marmalade one day and jam the next. Yet even he admitted, when alone with Miss Marple in the garden, that Ainsworth had always loathed marmalade. "Could have changed," said the Colonel stubbornly. "Oh, yes," said Miss Marple. "People often do, though dislikes formed in childhood can be remarkably tenacious." The Colonel frowned. "You think the fellow an impostor?" "My dear Colonel, I think nothing so theatrical. Life is usually less obliging than that." This answer annoyed him, because like many straightforward men he preferred even alarming certainty to mild ambiguity. That afternoon there was to be a small charity bridge gathering at the vicarage, arranged weeks before and now made more attractive by Captain Ainsworth's presence. Griselda, who loved company and mild disorder, had doubled the sandwiches and forgotten the scorecards. Before leaving for the vicarage, Miss Marple asked if she might see the morning room once more. Mrs. Bantry, distracted by gloves, said certainly. The little rosewood desk stood near the window, innocent as furniture often appears when it has recently been useful to someone. Miss Marple opened the drawer. Inside were envelopes, old household bills, blunt pencils, sealing, wax, and several photographs loose at the back. She examined them gently. One showed a garden party from years earlier. Colonel Bantry younger, broader, louder even in stillness, Mrs. Bantry under an absurd hat. Several villagers half-turned toward the camera, and near the edge, standing beside a trellis, Edward Ainsworth laughing at something outside the frame. His left hand held a cigarette. Miss Marple looked longer than the photograph required. Then she replaced it and shut the drawer. At the vicarage, Captain Ainsworth was already there, speaking pleasantly to Mrs. Price Ridley while shuffling cards with neat competence. He handled them with his right hand now. Miss Marple noticed that too. Many people believe observation means seeing extraordinary things. It more often means seeing ordinary things steadily until they become extraordinary by accumulation. Bridge began badly and improved little. The vicar revoked a trump he had never possessed. Mrs. Price Ridley accused the cards of sticking. And Griselda laughed so much at losing that others lost concentration through irritation. Captain Ainsworth played well enough, but not as he once had. "You used to bid recklessly," said Griselda cheerfully. "Colonel Bantry says you terrified tables. Did I?" He replied with his polished smile. "Age teaches caution. Again, possible, entirely possible." Yet Miss Marple remembered hearing years ago that Edward Ainsworth hated bridge and only played to flirt with Clara West's aunt, who considered cards a sign of vigour. In the middle of the second rubber, a maid entered with a note. "For Captain Ainsworth, sir." He took it, glanced once, and rose immediately. "I must beg forgiveness, a matter requiring a short walk. I shall return presently." He did not return. By 6 o'clock, speculation had ripened beautifully. Miss Hartnell believed the foreign widow had summoned him. Dr. Haydock thought perhaps a business telegram had followed the note. Griselda hoped for romance because she found secrecy decorative when it happened to others. Miss Marple asked only who had delivered the message. "A boy," said Griselda, "from the lane. Said a lady gave it to him. Which lady? He didn't know." Miss Marple nodded. When she left the vicarage, dusk had already fallen over St Mary Mead. Lamps glowed behind curtains. The church tower stood dark against a fading sky. Somewhere a gate clicked shut. Near the lane, behind the rectory, she saw movement by the hedge. Not Captain Ainsworth. Miss Clara West. She stood very straight, wearing a dark coat and gloves, as though cold had nothing to do with it. Time had altered her less than expected. She was older, certainly, but still composed, still pale, still self-contained in the manner that made some call her reserved and others call her wise. "Miss West," said Miss Marple gently. "Miss Marple, you have come unexpectedly." Yes, they looked at one another with the courtesy of two women who knew that directness need not be rude. "You have seen him?" asked Miss Marple. "I have seen someone calling himself Edward Ainsworth. There are moments when truth does not arrive, but simply becomes audible." Miss Marple did not start. "I thought you might say so." Clara's face changed slightly then, not into surprise, but relief. "You knew?" "I knew something was wrong." Knowing what is another matter. Clara drew a breath. "I was engaged to Edward. Briefly, everyone knew that much and little else. We parted for reasons that concerned only ourselves. But before he left England, he wrote me one final letter. He enclosed a photograph and said that if ever I doubted memory, I should trust habits more than faces." "How very sensible," said Miss Marple. "He was left-handed," said Clara quietly. "Strongly so. At school they tried to correct it and failed. He signed with his left hand, shot left-handed, smoked left-handed, threw stones left-handed, and once broke a vase, reaching across me awkwardly with the wrong arm to prove he could use the right." Miss Marple smiled faintly. "Yes, such things are stubborn," Clara continued. "When I heard he had returned, I came a tea once. But the man at Gossington Hall is not Edward. Do you know who he is?" "No, but I know who he is not. That distinction, though modest, is often the beginning of justice." They walked slowly toward Miss Marple's cottage together. Along the lane, lamps glimmered in cottage windows. Someone was singing badly indoors. A bicycle rattled past. Ordinary life continued, as it nearly always does beside deception. Why would someone pretend to be him after 12 years? Asked Clara. For money, perhaps, for access, for protection, for something hidden in plain sight, said Miss Marple. Most frauds depend not on invention, but on the willingness of others to accept what comforts them. Clara was silent. Then she sighed. There is one more thing. Edward had a scar above the wrist from a riding fall. The man today wore his cuffs carefully buttoned. Miss Marple's eyes brightened. Thank you. Set is useful, though, less useful than the marmalade. Clara looked at her. The marmalade? Yes, said Miss Marple. One must never neglect breakfast evidence. When they reached the cottage gate, Miss Marple paused. The truth has been with us since he arrived, she said. Name, face, manner, all arranged to distract from what cannot be rehearsed indefinitely. Taste, habit, reflex, memory of affection. The small untidy signatures of being oneself. Then what shall we do? Miss Marple looked back toward the darkening road that led to Gossington Hall. We shall wait, she said. Because people pretending to be someone else nearly always need something before they can leave. At that very moment. Across the village, Captain Ainsworth was entering the locked study at Gossington Hall with a candle in one hand and a key that did not belong to him in the other. Rain began shortly after midnight, soft at first and then steady enough to wash the lanes clean and keep sensible people indoors. It was the kind of rain St Mary Mead knew well. Patient and thorough, tapping at windows, darkening hedges, and turning every secret journey into a muddied inconvenience. By breakfast, the village had two new facts. Captain Ainsworth had returned to Gossington Hall very late, and Colonel Bantry's study had been found disturbed. The second fact travelled faster. Nothing appeared violently ransacked. No drawers pulled out, no papers strewn, no broken lock. Yet the room had that unmistakable air of having been searched by someone who wished not to appear searching. Books slightly misaligned. Inkstand moved half an inch. Coal scuttle angled oddly. A cabinet door not fully closed. Colonel Bantry, affronted on principle, declared that thieves nowadays lacked standards. Mrs. Bantry was more practical. But what could Edward possibly want in your study? Nothing, roared the colonel. And if he wanted something, he had only to ask. Captain Ainsworth, summoned by the raised voices, arrived, composed but pale. My dear Bantry, if some servant has been tidying badly, no servant tidies my dispatch box, said the colonel. There was, on the desk, an old leather dispatch box containing estate papers, hunting accounts, letters, and the sort of miscellaneous documents country houses preserve long after usefulness has died. Its brass clasp stood open. Captain Ainsworth looked at it only once. Then he looked away. That was the moment Miss Marple, who had come in quietly with her umbrella still damp, decided the matter had ripened sufficiently. Colonel Bantry, she said gently, before anyone becomes cross in the wrong direction, might one ask whether anything specific is missing? The colonel huffed, sorted papers noisily, and then frowned. A photograph album gone. Beastly old thing, family snapshots mostly. Why anyone would take it, I cannot imagine. Miss Marple could. She did not say so yet. Captain Ainsworth spread his hands. This is absurd. Surely no one suspects me of stealing old photographs. No one has said so, said Miss Marple. He gave her a quick glance. People often reveal anxiety not when accused, but when anticipating accusation. Mrs. Bantry fluttered. Jane, do say something sensible. I hope too, said Miss Marple. She turned to Captain Ainsworth. When did you first know Colonel Bantry? He smiled faintly. At Oxford, naturally, indeed. Which college? There was a pause so brief most would miss it. Trinity? Colonel Bantry stared. Good Lord, man, neither of us went to Oxford. We met in Sussex during training. Silence followed, thick and immediate. Captain Ainsworth recovered admirably. Of course, slip of the tongue, yes, said Miss Marple. Though slips of the tongue usually borrow from truth, not invent universities, Colonel Bantry reddened. What the devil is this? Miss Marple remained mild. Something that has been present from the start. I think Captain Ainsworth's pleasant expression thinned. I dislike riddles, as do I, said Miss Marple. Which is why I prefer habits. She moved to the breakfast table. You took tea without milk after always taking milk. You ate marmalade though hating it. You buttered toast with your left hand one morning and used your right hand the next because you had begun performing handedness instead of living it. You remembered public facts and forgot private ones. You recognized names but not affections. Mrs. Bantry sank into a chair. You mean? I mean this gentleman is not Edward Ainsworth. No thunder followed, though it would have suited the moment. Only rain at the windows. Colonel Bantry took one heavy step forward. Who are you? The man straightened. For the first time since arriving, the warmth left him completely. A question, he said quietly, to which different answers have been useful. Then he moved suddenly. Not toward the door, but toward the dispatch box. He seized a packet of papers and ran for the side passage. Colonel Bantry lunged, missed and collided with a chair. Mrs. Bantry screamed once with great efficiency, Dr. Haydock. Entering, at precisely the right moment for later storytelling, blocked the passage instinctively. The impostor swerved through the morning room instead, overturned the rosewood desk and reached the terrace doors before to gardeners. Hearing the commotion, caught him outside in the wet gravel. He struggled hard, not like a gentleman inconvenienced, but like a cornered professional. When, at last, he was held fast, Miss Marple looked not at him, but at the packet he had dropped. Inside were letters, old letters. Some tied in blue ribbon, others loose, all written many years before. Clara West entered the hall at that moment, still wearing travelling clothes. She saw the man on the floor and went white, though not from fear. So, she said, You found them. The impostor laughed once. Too late. Miss Marple handed the packet to her. I think they were always yours. Clara took them carefully. Colonel Bantry looked from one face to another in exasperation. Will someone explain? Miss Marple obliged. 12 years ago, when Miss West and Edward Ainsworth ended their engagement, letters were exchanged privately. Some were sentimental, some personal, and some, if youthful honesty was present, perhaps embarrassing. Edward, before leaving England, entrusted a packet temporarily to Colonel Bantry, meaning to reclaim it later or have it returned discreetly. Bantry blinked. Did he? Dash it! Perhaps he did. You placed it in the dispatch box and forgot it entirely, which is very natural in men. Mrs. Bantry nodded vigorously. Extremely natural, Miss Marple continued. Someone abroad learned of these letters. Perhaps through the real Edward, perhaps after his death. Clara closed her eyes briefly. Death? Said Mrs. Bantry. I am afraid so, said Miss Marple, or I strongly suspect it. This man knew enough to use his name, enough to know he once loved Miss West, enough to know Bantry might possess something valuable for blackmail or leverage. The impostor smiled coldly. Valuable indeed. Respectable villagers pay dearly to keep romance respectable. Clara looked at him with complete contempt. You understand nothing. Perhaps, he said. Miss Marple inclined her head. He came not to live Edward's life, but to retrieve what Edward once left behind. Colonel Bantry glared. And the widow from Bombay. "A woman who knew him under another name, I imagine," said Miss Marple. "She came, seeking acknowledgement, as I said, Doctor." Haydock tightened his grip on the prisoner's shoulder. "Well, he'll have acknowledgement enough now." There remained one final silence. Clara opened the top letter, glanced at the handwriting, and smiled sadly. "It is Edward's," she said. "Untidy as ever." Miss Marple nodded. "Yes." Handwriting, like habits, resists disguise. The rain eased. Outside, villagers were already gathering at gates, pretending to inspect weather conditions while staring openly toward Gossington Hall. Inside, truth had done what it usually does once admitted. It had made everything that came before seem obvious. Only one question remained unresolved. What had happened to the real Edward Ainsworth? Miss Marple, looking at the impostor's face, believed she knew where the answer would be found. By noon, the news had reached every cottage, lane, garden wall, and shop counter in St Mary Mead, which meant it had also acquired several improvements. In one version, the false Captain Ainsworth had leapt from a second-floor balcony with pistols in both hands. In another, Miss Marple had exposed him by quoting Latin. Mrs. Pollitt preferred the account in which Clara West struck him smartly with an umbrella, though no umbrella had been involved. The truth, as usual, was quieter. The man who had called himself Edward Ainsworth was locked in the small room behind the constable's office at Much Benham. Damp, angry, and considerably less impressive without a tailored coat and borrowed history. Inspector Slack arrived before afternoon tea and at once took charge in the energetic manner of a man who enjoyed official movement almost. As much as official success, he greeted Miss Marple with wary politeness. "Morning, Miss Marple. I understand there's been some excitement." "A little," she said. "And you've solved it already, no doubt. I should not put it so strongly," said Miss Marple. "I have only noticed what did not fit." Inspector Slack grunted, which in his case was close to respect. The prisoner at first refused cooperation, then offered false names, then demanded a solicitor, then claimed the entire matter was a misunderstanding caused by resemblance and hospitality. By 4 o'clock, however, facts had begun arriving from London and farther afield. He was Arthur Vale, sometimes clerk, sometimes agent, sometimes companion to elderly gentlemen with poor memory and excellent silver. He had been questioned before in connection with forged references, missing papers, and impersonations that relied less on brilliance than on confidence. In Bombay, he had attached himself to expatriate circles where gossip moved freely and records slowly. There, some months earlier, he had met a dying man, Edward Ainsworth. The real one had succumbed after a fever complicated by years of weakened health. He had spoken at intervals of England, of St Mary Mead, of an old friend named Bantry, and of letters once left in safe keeping. A nurse had remembered hearing the name Clara several times. Vale had listened. He had done what men of that kind often do when chance offers them another person's unfinished life. He had stepped into it, not perfectly. Perfection is unnecessary when others wish to believe. At Gossington Hall that evening, the household was subdued in the tender, exhausted way that follows scandal once practical matters are complete. Mrs. Bantry cried a little for the real Edward, whom she had not seen in 12 years and had almost forgotten until losing him properly. Colonel Bantry was furious with himself for forgetting the letters, for trusting appearances, and for once nearly attending Oxford by accident through someone else's lie. Doctor. Haydock prescribed rest to everyone except himself. Clara West sat in the morning room with the recovered packet beside her. She had not yet decided whether to burn the letters, keep them, or read them all once more and then decide differently. Miss Marple joined her quietly. "I am sorry," said Clara. "For which part?" "For being right." Miss Marple smiled. "My dear, being right is very often the least pleasant outcome." Clara touched the ribbon on the packet. "I ended our engagement because he wanted movement and I wanted steadiness. I thought time would simplify that decision." "It appears time does very little simplification." "No," said Miss Marple. "It mostly rearranges furniture." "That brought the smallest laugh I should have recognized at once," Clara said. "Yet, when I heard he had returned, part of me wanted it to be true so much that I nearly accepted the wrong voice." "That is no disgrace," said Miss Marple. "Frauds survive on hope more than deceit." Clara was silent for a moment. "He wrote me after we parted, kindly, better than either of us deserved. I never answered the last letter." "Then perhaps you answer now," said Miss Marple, glancing at the packet. "By remembering him accurately." Outside, twilight settled over St Mary Mead. Lamps glowed behind curtains. A bicycle bell rang somewhere near the post office. Ordinary life, patient and undefeated, resumed its place. Later, in the drawing room, Inspector Slack came to report. "We'll pursue the matter properly," he said. "There may be charges beyond impersonation. Financial approaches in India, possible theft, perhaps worse. If Ainsworth died naturally, that simplifies one side of it, and if not, asked Colonel Bantry." Slack adjusted his cuffs. "Then it complicates another." He hesitated near the door. "Miss Marple, how did you know first?" She considered. "I did not know first. I only doubted first." "Yes, but from what?" "Oh, several things. The tea, the bridge, the summer house." "The summer house." "It was demolished years ago," said Miss Marple. "Yet he pretended to remember sheltering there with Miss West. People lying often accept offered memories too quickly." "Because they do not know which ones are dangerous," Slack nodded reluctantly. "And the main thing." Miss Marple's eyes moved toward the old photograph now resting on the mantel. "He had facts," she said, "but he did not have affection. Real memory has warmth in odd places. It pauses over useless details. It smiles before speaking." He remembered what happened, but not how it felt. Inspector Slack stared for a second, then coughed. "Well, useful, I'm sure. After he left Raymond, West declared it the finest line spoken in the village for years and begged permission to use it in a book. Miss Marple forbade him instantly. The next morning, Clara departed before most were awake. She left a short note for Mrs. Bantry, thanking her kindness, and another for Miss Marple containing only one sentence: "You were right. Habits are truer than faces." Miss Marple placed the note inside her Bible for safekeeping, not from piety but organization. As for the letters, Clara took them with her. No one asked again what they contained. Villagers enjoy secrets best when unopened. Weeks later, people still discussed the impostor, but less and less. Seasons changed. Roses were cut back. New gossip arrived. The postman remained reliable except on Thursdays. Yet those who had watched closely remembered something else. The man who came back had changed. That was what everyone said. Miss Marple had seen that the important thing was what had not changed at all: the stubborn little truths of habit, memory, taste, gesture, and feeling that belong to a person more securely than name or face ever can. And because those truths had been present from the very beginning, the ending was never really a surprise. Only a recognition